We all know that Ukraine wants to join NATO, but that it is a non starter for politicians in the West. Of course, the reason why Kyiv is interested in NATO is obvious. With membership comes the military power of the alliance. That might take an expected outcome of war, say here, and shift it into a direction favorable to Ukraine. Now, let me be clear up front. Unequivocally, Ukraine would be better off under this circumstance. But what I find interesting is that the political gridlock in NATO is being treated as strict downside for Kyiv. And sure, it is not great. However, sometimes you have to make lemons from lemonade. Let me explain. Given that a shift in the outcome like this is not happening, the West is failing to exploit a hidden bargaining leverage from it. Think of it as a consolation prize of sorts. You see, the more that NATO is infeasible now, the more territory that Ukraine should be able to hold in any sort of peace negotiations with Russia. Thus, as the Trump administration begins looking for an end to the war, a simple freezing of the front line is an even worse outcome than it appears on the surface. To unravel this mess, today we will begin with a false perception about what Russia and Ukraine are really fighting over. The key strategic dynamics of this type of situation involving power shifts, a special focus on how long Ukraine will need to wait to join NATO, and then some classic lines on maps to understand why the delay at least provides Ukraine with some short-run benefits. We will then finish with a quick thought about what this means for the Trump peace plan overall. But we begin with what Ukraine and Russia are fighting over. I think a common perception of the war would generate three primary answers. My goal is to convince you that they are actually all the same thing, or at least kind of. Let's go through each of them. It is easy to convince people that there is a territorial component to the war. There are literal land battles here. The lines are constantly being redrawn, and the Kremlin has visions of establishing the area as New Russia. What is more nebulous is the political control component. This is a battle that dates back to Ukrainian independence. That Russia wants Kyiv to be Kiev, and under its sphere of influence. The implications there include everything from cushy agreements regarding Crimean naval facilities, to Russian culture remaining present in the country. But note that these two goals are really the same thing. One way to do it is via treaties and legal institutions. The other way is territory. Russia can force particular sections of the country to follow those demands by simply annexing them, as made Federation law on September 30th, 2022. Let me repeat this because it is something that I hear war commentators miss all the time. Territorial control is political control. It is just political control the hard way. Now, NATO membership sounds like it is part of the sphere of influence thing, but there is a big difference here. For Ukraine, and all other alliance members for that matter, NATO is a means to an end. It is not an end in and of itself. It is easy to confuse this from the outside. After all, European countries on Russia's doorstep have worked tirelessly to gain entry. But if you understand the logic of lines on maps theory, that is no surprise. Remember, the policies that you can politically resist versus Russia depend on how you expect a war to unfold. If you have NATO backing and are better able to resist, then congratulations. You can stand firm on more favorable ground. Military power is political currency, and NATO has a ton of purchasing power. Indeed, this is true of any military technology. It is the same reason why opponents of Iran do not care directly about Iran developing nuclear weapons, so much as how Tehran could use nuclear weapons to coerce those countries on the substantive issues that they do care about. No one is looking at a shiny new weapon system and thinking to themselves, hey, this thing intrinsically makes me happy. I am so glad to have it. Okay, fine. Something like HIMARS is an engineering marvel and is cool in that sense. Then again, maybe they could have designed it to not have the door get stuck on the mounted gun. My point here is that Poland's share of HIMARS exports cost $10 billion. Engineering marvel, yes, but $10 billion of intrinsic enjoyment, no. At that price, you could instead endow a new university that would rank between Cornell and Chicago. And if you have that kind of money, please send me a message. The latter is intrinsically useful. The former is not. In turn, the spillover consequences of military capacity are why the Kremlin is so concerned about Ukraine joining NATO. Again, it is not NATO by itself. Nor is it that the United States is going to be using Ukrainian planes as a staging ground to invade Russia. It is that when Moscow makes demands out of Kyiv, or else, Kyiv will just respond by selecting the or else option and feel comfortable about deciding policy within its own borders, not under the Kremlin's influence. This distinction is not obvious. If you want to see a whole lot of researchers waste their own time and countless others' time as well, then hop back into the 1980s and read a whole bunch of work where everyone is talking past each other on this point, not understanding how military power leads to greater payoffs, but are not direct payoffs themselves. In fact, it took one of the OG Lines on Maps researchers to get our discipline back on track. But the distinction matters quite a bit when you delve deeper into coercive bargaining strategy, and that is where we need to spend the rest of our time in this video. With that as our preface, let's lay out the key components of the situation that Ukraine and Russia find themselves in. Among crisis bargaining researchers, bargaining over power has become a popular topic to study over the last 15 years. Heck, my self-respecting academic alter ego is also included in that group. But today, I want to focus on a claim from this paper, titled Commitment Problems in Alliance Formation, coincidentally published right before Russia's invasion began. What we need to do here is analyze the consequences of these 5 features of the current strategic environment. First is the point from the previous section, that Russia wants greater control over Ukraine, and Ukraine wants to stop that. Second, Ukraine and Russia care about the control between the two, both now and in the future. Crises are not one-time affairs. Third, fighting a war to resolve this political question, hello there, Karl von Clausewitz, imposes costs on both sides. Fourth, Ukraine would be better able to militarily resist Russian encroachments as a NATO member than under the status quo. And finally, it is plausible that Ukraine will enter into NATO in the future, even if it will not be immediate. But no one can predict exactly when this will happen. The first 4 points are straightforward, and while I do not think that the 5th is controversial, it is worth elaborating a bit more about it. And hey, look at that! We have a whole section on Ukraine's entry timeline. You may already know that Ukraine has officially applied for membership via the letter seen here, but also that this step is the least important part of the process. Indeed, you are likely already familiar with one dimension of the problem: NATO's requirement that applicants resolve all ongoing territorial disputes on their soil. Now, the reason that this rule is well known is that it encouraged Russia to exacerbate tensions in Ukraine to forestall the accession process. Lest we forget, the exact same thing happened with Georgia in 2008. Another problem is military coordination. NATO wants to save on costs by mass-producing weapons and equipment to set standards. Thus, it is a problem if NATO produces 155mm shells, but your country still uses legacy 152mm shells. Still, there is more to the story than just that. Otherwise, your country would simply become a purchaser of NATO arms exports, but not an actual member. After all, NATO is not a charity. It does not admit new countries out of benevolence. Rather, it expects there to be some benefit to the alliance that already pre-exists that comes along with the enlargement. Ironically, the war is improving Ukraine's argument for admission on both of the last two grounds. More 155mm systems get sent to Ukraine every month, a microcosm of the broader shift to Western weapons. Meanwhile, Ukraine's future contribution to NATO is that its soldiers know how to fight modern wars. Once this war ends, NATO's military strategists are going to be asking Ukrainians to fly into Brussels and elsewhere in Europe and the United States to give lectures on the subject. And even if we narrow down the conversation to Ukraine's specialization in drone warfare, that would be a compelling argument alone about the country's value added. After all, Russia is learning a lot about that too, and NATO does not want to fall behind. However, there is one last problem. NATO started as an organization geared toward resisting Soviet expansion. Consequently, after the end of the Cold War, NATO suffered a bit of an identity crisis. Part of NATO's self-reflection from a 1995 study on enlargement was that the organizational focus should shift to the promotion of democracy, freedom, and market-oriented economies. In that light, the war has created a catch-22 for Ukraine. Since 2010, there has been one normal presidential election in Ukraine, Zelensky's 2019 victory over incumbent Petro Poroshenko. Moreover, there have only been two since 1999. In other words, Ukraine has not established a democratic legacy to the level that NATO countries would like to see. The last thing that NATO wants is for a country that looks like it is in a democratic position today suddenly to turn south and become the next Hungary or Turkey. And the ironic thing is that Ukraine cannot establish a democratic tradition until after the war ends. Its constitution prohibits elections as long as fighting continues. To be clear, these factors explain why Ukraine has not already joined NATO. But at the end of the day, they are just guiding principles. At some point, the alliance could collectively decide that it is time to move past them and admit Ukraine regardless of what else is going on in the world. However, when that will happen depends on a host of factors, like which leaders are elected in current member states and what their collective appetite for risk is. Thus, Ukraine will not be joining NATO anytime soon, not as long as Hungary and Turkey stand in the way, and the United States and Germany worry about increasing the risk of a direct confrontation with Russia. At some point in the future, though, Ukraine will likely join the alliance. It is just impossible for anyone to reliably predict when that day will arrive. And now we can get to the meat of today's video: how much territory Ukraine can retain while convincing Russia to end its invasion. Oh, and as a general reminder here, my job as someone who studies crisis bargaining is equivalent to an engineer tasked with examining how a bridge could be built over a river. You might not like the hoops that you have to jump through to span the gap, or how much you will have to spend to do so. But blaming me for that would be like blaming the engineer for the existence of gravity. Don't shoot the messenger. Anyway, in the Kremlin's ideal world, Ukraine disappears from the map, both today and into the future. But Russia faces some constraints. One is that, at some point in the future, Ukraine will join NATO, and the balance of power will shift against Russia. The second is that, even with the balance of power as it is today, continuing to pursue the war is costly, and seemingly growing costlier every day. The alternative for Russia is to try to negotiate some type of peace deal, at this point brokered by Trump. More on his involvement here in a minute. However, the Kremlin will want to factor in how an agreement would work today, and the constraints on such an agreement in the future. Let's focus on that latter bit. Once Ukraine joins NATO, inevitably Ukraine will have the power to stand firm against onerous Russian encroachments. There will be some wiggle room due to each side's costs of war, but a credible deal must be somewhere around here. Now, precisely because Russia does worse in the future, The Kremlin would need more today to prefer the combination of the short-run deal and the long-run deal to a war outcome presently. How much does this increase Russia's minimum demands by? Well, that depends on how much the Kremlin cares about short-term payoffs versus long-term payoffs. Maybe ask the powers that be how they feel about historical legacies and all that, though you might also wish to consider the age of Kremlin leadership. More of a future focus would actually raise the Kremlin's present demands because of how bad the post-NATO outlook is. It also depends on how much protection NATO membership provides to Ukraine. Again, presumably this is a great deal, and that also implies higher present demands from the Kremlin, once more because the future looks bad. Finally, it depends on what exactly the future means here. Are we talking about next year, for certain? Or will it be 10 years before Ukrainian entry becomes plausible? And even then, the stars will have to align for it to work. Here is the thing, though. The longer that this goes into the future, the less the Kremlin's bottom line will be in the present. That may seem weird at first. Usually, coercive bargaining leverage is correlated. If you are capable of demanding one thing, then you are probably capable of demanding other things too. But remember, NATO is not an end. It is a means to an end. And this is where that distinction starts to have some bite. If the long-run outlook begins to look better for Russia, then Ukraine can leverage that threat to make greater demands now. Put differently, if NATO is not in the picture, then Russia has less of a desire to try to get something while the getting is good. And that is the central point for today. Yes, it would be ideal for Ukraine if tomorrow we all woke up and inexplicably Ukrainian flags were flying over the Brussels headquarters. But we do not live in Ukraine's ideal world. That is the bad news for Kyiv. The good news is that there is a consolation prize. Russia will accept divisions further to the east in the present than would otherwise be the case if NATO membership were closer to reality. And that leads us to a couple of closing points about how the Trump administration is thinking about structuring a peace deal. We have discussed before the proposal from Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg. It seems relatively agnostic about how Russia and Ukraine will divide the territory, though I should note that Kellogg commonly expresses firm anti-Russia sentiment in his personal comments. Read into that as much as you want, and speculate further about how that projects onto Trump's thinking of the situation. Regardless, there is little reason to have ambivalence be the default policy, and to implement the current line of control because, well, it is the current line of control. If Russia is satisfied with its efforts to throw up roadblocks on the path toward Ukrainian entry into NATO, so be it. At least use that as leverage to allow Ukraine to retain more territory. To be clear, that does not mean that the line of control is the wrong division to implement. If military and intelligence analysts agree that a prolonged war would produce an expected outcome far west of the current line of control, which is not the consensus in the open source intel community, then freezing things as they stand would be a relatively good outcome compared to the alternative for Ukraine. On the other hand, if economic pressure is putting the Kremlin in an increasingly vulnerable position, then the current line of control would represent a vast overpayment to Russia. And it is worth noting that flooding military aid to Ukraine resolves the problem in a different way. The Kremlin's alternative to a peace deal is continued war today. The worse that is for Russia, the more conciliatory the Kremlin is forced to be. And it comes with the bonus of forcing Russia to acknowledge Ukraine's accession to NATO. Remember, the problem from Russia's perspective is that NATO massively shifts the balance of power in Ukraine's favor. But resetting this to a hypothetical status quo, if the United States floods weapons into Ukraine, then the line shifts right now, and in turn, the net additional effect of future NATO membership is minimal. And it is the net difference between the two of these that defines the Kremlin's credibility of trying to keep Ukraine out of NATO. Note that when it is small like this, there is little credibility. No doubt that the Kremlin will get on the phone with Western leaders and complain. But trying to do something to stop it is too risky given the small shift. Rather, it is the big shift that causes the problem. Just one more thing for the Trump administration to consider. Actually, there are a couple of more things that they need to think about. First is whether to watch an in-depth Q&A video on what Trump has done since he entered office over on the Lines on Maps Extra channel. And second is which of these two books to read to learn more about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.